El Tuzaní de la Alpujarra by Calderón de la Barca is a tragic love story set against the backdrop of the Civil War, specifically the Morisco Rebellion that took place in Granada and the surrounding area between 1568 and 1571. The uprising was touched off, among other things, by the enactment in 1567 of a proclamation by Philip II that prohibited all expressions of Morisco culture: clothing, language, books, everything. The rebellion saw 3 years of bloodshed and was finally brutally put down by Philip II's half-brother, Don Juan de Austria. It should come as no surprise, then, that there is an abundance of violence in this play. In addition to the standard sword and musket violence of war, there's wholesale massacre, individual murder, blood vengeance, regicide, and of course, duels of honor. But the violence I will focus on here did not, in theory at least, involve bloodshed, although it contributed, both in Calderón's play and historically, to the rebellion. I'm referring here to the campaign of ethnocide, or mandatory assimilation, carried out against the Moriscos, beginning with the forced conversions in 1502, and culminating with the edict of Philip II, which sparked the war. This project, of course, failed utterly, and the Morisco Rebellion served to underline this fact. And it underlined what most old Christians already held to be true, that the Moriscos were culturally unassimilatable, duplicitous, conspiratorial, false Christians. In short, they were considered a danger to Spain and its religious unity, as well as its internal security. This perception was only worsened with time and led to the expulsion of the Moriscos, of course, between 1609 and 1614. Critical studies of El Tuzaní have, by and large, interpreted Calderón's treatment of the Moriscos as sympathetic. Alan A. Parker stated that the author of El Tuzaní was a man, quote, who was sensitive to the rights and sufferings of minority peoples, an opinion shared almost verbatim by Margaret Wilson. José Miguel Caso González insists that in El Tuzaní, Calderón, quote, ha manifestado su oposición a la política oficial, a las tendencias y usos sociales de su época y a una concepción racista de la sociedad de su tiempo, y ha defendido la dignidad caballeresca y ideológica de los moriscos bautizados. For his part, José Alcalá Zamora has indicated that in El Tuzaní we see, quote, el interés y benevolencia de Calderón hacia los medios culturales extraños y los grupos marginados, end quote. We may ask then, with Margaret Greer, quote, why would Calderón, famous for his service to the Catholic Church, and in his Autos Sacramentales long before he was ordained a priest in 1651, write a work that from its first lines conveys sympathy for the rebellious Granadine Morisco population, decades after the final expulsion from Spain? The simple answer to the question, I would submit, is that he didn't. I will argue that this sympathetic interpretation is the product of selective reading and anachronistic reading. Given limited time and space, I will focus only on the first part of the first act, as it is here that the Moriscos are first characterized and the sources of the conflict are introduced. One of the principal supports for the sympathetic reading of El Tuzaní de la Alpujarra is the portrayal of the Moriscos versus old Christians. José Alcalá Zamora has stated, for example, that, quote, la simpatía del dramaturgo se inclina ostensiblemente hacia la causa de los personajes moriscos, tratados con delicadeza y emoción, en contraste con los rasgos altaneros e intransigentes con que se caracteriza a los representantes de la cristiandad vieja. The argument that Calderón portrays the Moriscos in a positive light and the old Christians in a negative light depends, in my view, on two things: selective attribution and ideological anachronism. By selective attribution, I mean the assertion that the dialogue of a certain character represents the opinion of the playwright. It's worth reiterating the obvious: drama doesn't have a narrator. In drama, the ideological standpoint of the playwright is elusive. It has to be gleaned from the meaning generated by the interplay between words, actions, and stagings, and the cultural context in which the play is written and produced. In drama, when two characters voice opposite opinions, we cannot arbitrarily insist that the view of one or the other character represents that of the playwright, although the temptation may be strong, particularly when the opinion expressed by the character corresponds with our own. With respect to the ideological anachronism, it is again worth restating the obvious. To read El Tuzaní de Alpujarra in a way that is fair to its original context, we have to try to set aside our 21st century perspective and try to reconstruct, to the extent that that's possible, the perspective, the presuppositions of a Spanish audience of the 1630s. Careful then to avoid ideological anachronism and selective attribution, let's attempt to take a fresh look at the play. The opening scene of the play is important to the arguments in favor of sympathetic reading, so let's begin there. Briefly, in the opening scene, a group of moriscos gathers in secret to celebrate a fanda, or morisco dance. The celebration is interrupted by a loud banging at the door. Margaret Wilson gives this assessment of the play's beginning. Quote, "The play begins as the revolt did with the fiercely repressive legislation issued by Philip II in 1567. Calderón opens his play showing the Moriscos' reactions to it, thus directing the audience's sympathies towards them from the start." End quote. For her part, Margaret Beard explains the process of eliciting sympathy in the opening scene in terms of psychological violation. Quote, "With the first words of the play, Cádiz question, ¿Están cerradas las puertas?" Calderón opens the drama by evoking the intimate space of a house, the space of our human identifications, and of our primordial fears, one of which is the fear of seeing that intimate place invaded. The actor's attire, specified by Calderón in the first stage direction, has already signaled wordlessly that it is a Morisco residence, and the invaders, they fear, are the Christians. Are Christian. Let's take a close look at the scene, starting with the opening stage direction. Salen todos los moriscos que pudieren, vestidos a la morisca, jaquetillas y calzones, y las moriscas en jubones blancos, con instrumentos, cadí y albuscos. This opening stage direction is unusual because it gives details about the Morisco costumes. Moorish and Morisco characters appear in countless comedias. Yet a search through the hundreds of comedias transcribed in the Chadwick-Healy Teso database reveals that in almost every case, the costume of the Moorish or Morisco characters is described simply as moro, or de Morisco, or a la Morisca. The explanation for this lack of detail regarding the nature of the Morisco costume is simply that the autores de comedias didn't need to be told what a Moor or Morisco looked like. The costumes for various social types were conventionalized, and each company had a basic wardrobe of standard costume pieces for standard roles. Galán, dama, soldado, bandolero, moro, etc. In the relatively rare cases where details are given regarding the costumes, the purpose is to indicate something out of the ordinary, something distinctive about the costume. Perhaps a state of undress, or a specific color, or a deviation from the conventional.